You are welcome to another series of lecture under Literature 101, Introduction to Fiction. In this series, we want to continue from where we stopped in the last presentation, where we looked at elements of prose fiction from the perspective of plot. There are other elements of prose fiction apart from plot. That is why the title for this series is Elements of Prose Fiction Continued. So we are going to identify these elements of prose fiction and explain each of them for the purpose of empowering you with the knowledge that will help you using these prose fiction elements to analyze any prose work that you are able to lay your hands on. So the element of prose fiction we are going to look at first in this series is setting. There is no story that is told in a vacuum. Every story must take place at a particular place and a particular time. So when we talk about setting, we are talking about the time, the place in which the story in a narrative work takes place. Under this, we can talk about the physical location, historical period, social context, and the atmosphere. When we read a novel, we can trace that novel to a particular group of people, a particular place, and a particular time. For example, when we have a story that has characters like Adebimpe, Olu, Adio, Ajayi, or all those kind of names. Someone who is familiar with the Nigerian environment will not find it difficult to say that the setting of such a story is southwest Nigeria due to the use of Yoruba names that we have mentioned or any other names that are of Yoruba origin. When we have names of places like Lagos, Ibadan, Oyo, or even a name that we cannot trace a particular place where we can find it, peradventure, since it might be out of the author's invention, we can still identify the name of that place to a group of people living in a particular part of the world. So when we mention setting, when a story is told, it is expected that that story will have a particular place that can be identified as its context. If that is not there, the story will not make much sense, even sense at all, to the reader. At times, the setting, physical setting we are talking about, may not be a place where human beings occupy. It may be in the jungle, it may be a form of symbol. What is important is that there is a background for it as far as existence is concerned. Beyond the location or physical environment that makes up setting, we can also look at setting from the point of view of time. If a story is talking about what happened during the pre-colonial era, we don't need to uh, look for someone to tell the reader that this particular story has to do with the particular the post pre-colonial time. The reason is that issues raised will make one feel like this issue or these issues are not contemporary issues. They are issues that took place at so time, some decades ago, we talk about the way characters in that story dress, the way they appear, their ideology, what they put forward to, their relationship with one another will definitely portray the time the story is talking about. For example, if a story is uh, talking about the contemporary society, this time of ours, you can hear things like Facebook, things like AI, things like social network, and the rest of them. We don't need somebody to tell us that this story is contemporary, because we all know that about 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, or thereabout 15 years ago, issues of AI was not a common thing. Uh, Facebook, social media, TikTok, and the rest of them are alien to the generation of 50 years ago or 40 years ago. So, setting, location, time, background, historical background of a play or of a story can easily be identified based on the interaction between characters, issues raised in the story, relationship among characters, what the background of the story is all about. We help one to identify the type of setting that we are talking about. So, setting can be divided into mainly, generally, time setting, which is also called temporal setting, physical setting, which is also called spatial setting, or uh, whether the two of them, whether it is physical or it is time based, what we are looking at, the issues, the discussions, the interactions in the story will let one know which time the story is talking about, what place the story is all about. So if you are analyzing a literary work, it is good for us to read between the lines in order to identify the time setting of the story, the physical setting of the story. Physical setting based on the names the characters bear, the places mentioned, names of places mentioned in the story, the kind of issues raised in the story. Time setting, the time the story is referring to, those people that are characters there, their ideology, what they believe, and how they do things. All of these are basis for identifying the setting of a story. We have characters. Another aspect of narrative work that is very, very important in analyzing any story has to do with characters. At times we say characterization. When we say characterization, we are talking about how the author makes his characters to behave, how the author of the story allocates roles to his characters or the characters in his story. So, who are characters? Characters are the individuals who populate the story, who drive the plot forward, who are responsible for carrying out events in the story. Since a story will not take place in a vacuum, there will be individuals who will populate the setting, who will move from one position to another. So we expect that a good story will have at least one or two characters. Some of these characters may not fully participate or so much active in the story. We are going to look at whether characters are active, fully active, or passive in a story, and where we can categorize where any of them belongs. But what is important is that in any story, it is expected for the author to give roles to individuals. These individuals might not be real people. They usually they are usually fictional, imaginary, invented. But beyond that, we can still have real individuals whose name or names will appear in a story as characters in that story. But since we are paying attention to fiction, in fiction, mostly characters are fictional. They are created, they are creations of the author. But we need to note that it's not in all situations that characters are human beings. Characters may be animals, characters may be symbols, characters may be objects, depending on the choice of the author, what forms of characters he would like to choose to populate his story. So when we mention characters, there are different types of characters. One of them is protagonist. If we remove a protagonist from a story, that story is a dead story. There's no more a story because everything in the story surrounds the protagonist. The protagonist is the central character of the story and is often referred to as the main character. So everything that happens from the beginning of a narrative work to the end of it surrounds the main character, the protagonist. Usually if it's male is the hero of the story, if it's female is the heroine of the story. Everything surrounds him. If it is a tragedy, he will be the tragic hero. If it's a comedy, he will be the comic hero. Everything about the story has to do with the protagonist. If the protagonist is removed from the story, every other person who is a character in the story will not have much to do. In fact, it will be difficult to have any story. So we have to look at another type of character. And in this case, we have antagonist. When we look at it, we see it antagonist. That is someone who is in opposition to the protagonist. The protagonist is the main character, is the one who is trying to solve one problem or the other in a story. So in the opposite direction, we have the antagonist, who is a force that opposes the character of the protagonist. He is the one creating conflict and obstacles for the protagonist. While the protagonist is trying to solve a problem, the antagonist is trying to create a problem. For example, this like a joke. Let's just make use of this. You know, as young people, when we are young, when we be watching these American movies, films, Indian films, we usually identify two people. We will talk about the actor and the boss, or we call it boss. Even though these names are different from what they are supposed to mean when we talk about literature, but from the angle we saw it that time, for us to understand the concept of protagonist and antagonist better, we see the actor who is trying to solve a problem, who is trying to provide a solution and to a particular problem, while the boss is the one creating problem for him. Even if the protagonist tries his best, the antagonist will still come. So in this case, the actor is the protagonist, while the boss is the antagonist. So the antagonist can be a person, can be a group of people, can be an entity, or even an internal struggle within the protagonist. The protagonist himself may be an embodiment of antagonist. It may be some internal struggle, something that he is trying to find a solution to himself that will be working against him. And on many occasions, it may be an external force. If it's an external force, the force can be a person, the force can be a group of people, the force can be an entity. But if it is an internal force, the protagonist himself is the source of his antagonism, is the source of his problem. Mm. So we should look at that very well. Another type of character is major, has to do with major characters. Major characters are the ones that play central roles in a story. They are very, very significant and they are impactful in that narrative. If we remove the major characters from a story or the story will be meaningless. And usually, who are the major characters in a story? We talk about the protagonist and the antagonist and some other complex characters who undergo significant growth and change throughout the course of the story. Those who contribute to the complexity that is peculiar to the story. They are well developed, they are very significant. Removing them from the story will have a lot of effect on the story. The next set of character we are looking at is minor characters. So if we have major characters, we expect to have minor characters. These are supporting characters. These are individuals whose roles are not so important. If they are removed from a story or the story can still be meaningful. Their prominence or impact may not really be felt um unlike the major characters. But at times, some of them may grow from being minor characters to becoming major characters. But mostly, minor characters do not carry out so much function, uh, effective role as that. So if they are not there in the story may not have any effect, since their action or their role does not affect the flow of the plot. Another element of or another type of character under element of prose fiction where we are looking at characterization or character is round character or round characters. Round characters are fully developed characters. They exhibit a range of traits, emotions, and complexity. So they have their strengths, their weaknesses, their contradictions, which make them to have some relationship with the reality. So we can use them to look at a template for the reality where we can learn a lesson. So characters are dynamic, so they are not like minor characters. They develop along the story. They grow. They might be like when we look at To Kill a Mockingbird, we see the uh, character through which the story is narrated there, growing from being a naive person towards understanding the reality about life and then contributing to the fact that issues of color relation or looking down on people who are of colored skin should be discouraged. So when we talk about round characters, they are very, very important in a story. They move from maybe a position where they are not so recognized to a complex position. They grow along the story by experience. They can change. They also have internal conflict that need to be resolved throughout the story. We have flat characters. These are opposite to round characters. These are one-dimensional and less complex characters. They are predictable. They are stereotype characters. From the beginning to the end of the story, they do not change. They can be predicted. Their action can be or actions can be predicted. Their responses So situations can be predicted. So when you have a character that is predictable, we can say this is what he's going to do, and he actually does it. Um, that is regarded as a flat character. We also have foil character. Under foil characters, we have characters that are intentionally created to highlight or contrast the traits, motivations, or qualities of another character. Is there to copy, for example, the major character. They may have opposing personalities, beliefs, or circumstances which serve to emphasize certain aspects of the main character or enhance the thematic exploration of the story. So they usually copy uh, the character or the behavior or the role of the major character. They don't stand on their own for who they are, but they present themselves like the major character. So now we have looked at types of elements of prose from the perspective of character or characterization, and we have seen different characters. So when you read a novel, when you read a narrative work, one of the things we need to pay attention to is checking the role that each of the characters play that or plays. That is what will help us to determine or analyze the work objectively. If we can identify who the major characters are, who the minor characters are, who the flat characters are, who foil characters are, who the protagonist is or the antagonist are or is, will help to analyze the story objectively. That will help us to see the themes and the direction the plot flows. So this section series of lecture on elements of prose fiction we end here. We have studied characterization and the characters, and we have mentioned that characterization is how the author makes his characters to behave. Now, the various behavior of the characters will determine the type of characters they are, and that's what we have done. We have just done. So you are at the liberty to go through this series as I usually say. So you can go through it again and again. After going through it, you are expected to go through the questions that follow. Answering those questions correctly will enhance your performance, your CA. So it's necessary for you to get a good score in that regard. Till we meet again, thank you for listening. Bye.